During World War II, many famous Hollywood actors would participate in the military. Although many were not famous actors yet, a few had already made it big in movies and still decided to face the dangers of war. David Niven went to Army College in Britain, after which he enlisted into the British Army, which traveled to Hollywood, where he participated in a few small movie parts. When Britain declared war, Niven immediately returned home to help, contrary to many other British actors staying in Hollywood. Niven was a lieutenant in war and also acted in a number of British films that aimed to gain U.S. support for British war efforts. Niven actually would be one of the thousands of British soldiers in Normandy on D-Day. After the war, Niven would go on to star in movies like A Matter of Life and Death and Pink Panther. Jimmy Stewart was one of the few Hollywood actors that was actually an actor prior to enlisting in the war. Stewart's romantic comedy movies like Mr. Smith Goes to Washington and The Shop Around the Corner garnered him family before the start of World War II. Stewart would enlist into the war only a few months after the bombing of Pearl Harbor in 1941. Stewart probably could have used his popularity as a way to escape war and instead do morale tours around the country, but Stewart insisted on active participation in the war, where he trained to become a pilot. During the war, Jimmy Stewart was a bomber pilot over Germany, a dangerous job. Stewart would remain in the Air Force after the war, getting promoted up to general. After the war, Stewart would go on to act in several other Hollywood classics like It's a Wonderful Life and Vertigo. Jewish-born Kirk Douglas would join the Navy in 1941, in which he would become a communications officer in an anti-submarine warfare ship. He would later be medically discharged in 1944 after a depth charge explosion. After the war, Kirk Douglas would start his acting career and become famous for his movies like Tough Guys and The Way West. Kirk, whose birth name was Isser Danielovich, would change his name before enlisting. Audrey Hepburn probably played one of the most interesting roles during World War I. Audrey Hepburn's aristocratic family had varying support for Hitler until his brutal and violent occupation of the Netherlands and the Nazi murder of Audrey's uncle. At that point, Audrey and her mother became avid members of the Dutch resistance. Together, the two would help hide and transport Jews to safety. Audrey would also perform dances to raise money for the Dutch resistance. After the war, Audrey Hepburn would become famous for her roles in movies such as Breakfast at Tiffany's and War and Peace. Hepburn would go to great lengths to keep her heroic beginnings out of the public eye.
When the United States went to war in 1941, Roosevelt and Eisenhower had an idea. They knew that films and movies could provide a morale boost for their troops fighting overseas and provide a morale boost for the American citizens still at home. But Hollywood filmmakers and studio executives knew this as well. So the government offered a proposition to Hollywood. Will this picture help win the war? At first, Hollywood struggled to figure out how they were going to be able to turn a privately owned industry into a government-backed operation. But at around the same time that U.S. troops were breaking ground in Europe, so was Hollywood. Under the judgment, will this picture help win the war, Hollywood created many, many films. Most of these included films that were anti-Japanese propaganda and movies about the American soldier. The idea behind these types of films was to instill a belief in the government and the military into every American citizen at home. If they saw these films, the hope was that it would make them inspired to help out their country and their government. Even after the war ended, Hollywood continued to pump out movies that were heavily skewed towards the righteousness of the United States, again instilling nationalist propaganda to the average moviegoer. Along with the government controlling the types of movies that Hollywood produced, they were also involved in censoring many movies. If the movies did not fit the criteria of the question, will this picture help win the war, the movie was tossed aside. The government also did not allow movies that were anti-American or movies that showed the true nature of the war. Hollywood was very much stuck under the government's thumb for many, many years. These types of movies, however, were very popular with the American population and actually did accomplish the government's goal of creating American propaganda for the American population to enjoy. Hollywood's movies at the time also directed much hatred towards the Nazis. Many movies stereotyped Hitler and the Nazis as cold-hearted, evil, authoritarian people. These movies were aimed at trying to get the public to understand why Nazis were wrong and evil people. But movies also boosted the position of America in the war. While Nazis were being portrayed as they should have been, American soldiers were getting a little bit too much credit. Many films Hollywood put out were justifying the war and creating a sense of righteousness that became synonymous with the average American soldier. Hollywood's films were very much directed towards boosting an image of the American military by not telling the whole truth, while destroying the Nazis by telling the whole truth. At the time, movies were the largest and most popular form of entertainment. They could reach any mass audience with any movie that Hollywood produced. The idea of using the film industry as a way to create American and nationalist propaganda was a very smart move. Many Americans at the time really believed in the U.S. and their goal in the war because of the influence that Hollywood had over the American population.
Government influence in Hollywood. Much of the propaganda that was mentioned before was because of the government influence. This is a side effect of total war. Everything that was seen by the public was influenced to help the war effort. If you saw a movie, then normally before it started, there would be a government-issued message telling you about the war or asking you to enlist. This is another one of the countless reminders from the government that asked for the entire nation's help in the war effort, both at home and overseas. One way the government could affect Hollywood without the people knowing that they were involved was censorship. The Office of War Information could work with directors on site of movie production to make sure the movies were showing exactly what the government wanted the people to see. It was done to make sure the war was seen in a positive light. There was no American casualties on screen until 1943 because it was banned. At first, Hollywood did not want to comply with the government, so they could be the one form of media influence that wasn't controlled by them. But, like everyone else, they eventually partnered with the United States government in an effort to help with total war. Just recently, in 2008, it was discovered that many of the big-name actors were actually agents of the United States government and were placed in films to make sure the message made it to the big screen. More than 25% of the films that were made during the time of World War II were about the war, and most of them about the war were bashing the enemy. The government wanted to paint the enemy as badly as they could to make sure that people had enough hate to go and enlist in the war. Many of the other films were about life on the home front, and they were made to reassure that the women that were doing the work at home was valid, and that and the war effort was not, otherwise the war effort would be for nothing.
There are 100 million of us, men and women of working and fighting age. To fight this war, 10 million more people must go to work by the end of 1943. Before the war, half of us worked. The other 50 million kept house, went to school, played, or looked for work. Today, employment offices are deserted. For every machinist available, for example, 22 are needed. For every riveter available, 4 are needed. Employers faced with this crisis, pirate work